Welcome to this presentation on Nevada's Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. This information was developed in partnership with the Nevada Department of Education, WestEd, and Augenblick, Palick and Associates. This is the fourth video in the series. Other topics include an overview of the PCFP, PCFP details and calculation, revenues for education, and coordinating PCFP funds with other state and federal sources. Section 4, Allowable Use of PCFP Funds. This section covers the allowable use of PCFP funds, including requirements and allowable uses for the adjusted base and weighted funds. While categorical grants have been rolled together into the PCFP, the statutory requirements for many of these programs remain. School districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted students must still meet the requirements using PCFP funds. These categorical grants include AP exams, bullying grants, class size reduction, college and career-ready diploma incentives, computer education and technology, district library books, financial literacy professional development, Nevada Ready 21 technology, Read by Grade 3, school social workers, school resource officers, and special elementary counseling. School districts are expected to distribute adjusted per-pupil based funding to schools as described in the statute after deducting the allowable administrative expenses for the district. Adjusted per-pupil based funding makes up the majority of a school or district's revenue through the PCFP and is intended to be used to support the educational needs of all pupils in the district, such as operating expenses, supporting education personnel, carrying out programs, and meeting requirements for which separate funding is not appropriated. A school district can transfer funding from the adjusted base if it determines that the additional funding is needed to satisfy the federal maintenance of effort or other federal requirements for students with disabilities enrolled in the district. It can also transfer adjusted base per pupil funding into any weighted student category to supplement programs and services for that category of students. For the purposes of using weighted funding, an eligible pupil is a pupil who meets the eligibility requirement for one or more categories of weighted funding using current year data. A pupil is considered eligible to receive allowable supports and services using the weighted student funding from all categories they meet the eligibility criteria for, even if 1. They were not included in the student count that generated the weighted funding in the prior year, or 2. They generated funds from a different, higher weight funding category, or received special education funding. English learner PCFP dollars. Schools that receive funding for students generated through the EL weight must use the funding to provide Zoom services to eligible pupils. At-risk weight dollars. Schools receiving at-risk funding must use the funding to provide Victory services to eligible pupils. And schools receiving gifted and talented funding must follow guidelines around funding use, minimum service time, and qualified teachers. Remember, students must receive appropriate services for all weighted categories for which they are eligible. We're going to cover questions that we frequently get asked by district leaders and others about the use of PCFP funds. Must weighted funding be used on the same students for whom it was calculated? Each district, charter school, and university school for profoundly gifted students must ensure that all weighted funding received by the school or district is accounted for separately and distributed directly to the school in which eligible pupils are estimated to be enrolled. If a pupil changes schools during the school year, it is not necessary for the weighted funding for that pupil to also be transferred. It is understood that many programs, services, and supports provided by a school require financial commitment for the entire school year, and tying particular dollars to an individual student is not possible for stable budgeting practices. Are there spending restrictions on weighted PCFP funds? Yes, weighted funds must be used for services for eligible students in the category that generated the funding. School districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted students cannot use weighted funding for administrative costs, collective bargaining, or district-wide pay raises. Reporting. School districts must separately account for the use of weighted student funding using separate funds aligned with reporting by fund in the annual financial report and the annual staffing and budget comparison report. Additionally, reporting is required to identify the cost of some special education and some gifted and talented services, including instruction provided by licensed special education teachers and supporting staff, related services including without limitation, services provided by psychologists, therapists, and health-related personnel, transportation to and from school for pupils who are gifted and talented, as well as pupils with disabilities, the direct supervision of educational and supporting programs, and the supplies and equipment needed for providing special education. See the next video in this series on coordinating PCFP funds with other state and federal sources.